Here we are now. We are on record. I forgot for a few minutes, but here we are at school for A Course in Miracles, where the universe of learning is opening up before us. And we're learning how to learn. We're learning how to learn together. And we're also learning how to learn from the Holy Spirit and how to let his guidance relieve us of the guilt of thinking we're the doer, the guilt of thinking that we can accomplish something of ourselves independently, but we're learning that everything has already been accomplished, and that the Holy Spirit is teaching us how to see what is already accomplished, how to see joy, how to see peace, how to see love, how to see the abstract and the intangible under his guidance and direction. And the miracles, that's the miracle. The miracle is really waking to that and seeing that, and that the miracle is, as he says, the miracle's always here. It's always here. It's just you've been in the dark. I've been in the dark, so you can't see. But as you accept the teachings of the Holy Spirit, and you are willing to put your mind under a true authority. And so this is what he says about that. It is on page 30, if you want to go there. I mean, I'm so moved by reading chapters 1 and 2 again, because starting the new immersion, we're also starting the workbook lessons. So, I thought to read these beginning chapters as well, and how rich these beginning chapters are, how everything is there. Everything is there in those first couple of chapters. And of course, as we go on with the course, we learn everything is everything and is everywhere all the time. But we couldn't see that way. Anyway, it is possible to reach a state in which you bring your mind under my guidance without conscious effort. But this implies a willingness that you have not developed as yet. Well, remember, I mean, this is chapter 2, and we have been at this a little bit longer than, a few weeks. We've had some practice at putting our minds under the a true authority of the Holy Spirit or Jesus. So I think our willingness, at least I'll speak for myself, my willingness has gotten a great deal greater. I didn't even know what willingness was, let alone know what it was for. So, like, what is he talking about here? But at this point, we all have experience of willingness, and we have developed some. The Holy Spirit cannot ask more than you are willing to do. So here we all are joining together, and in the school of the universe, and the Holy Spirit is our teacher. And this is the state that we're developing, the vigilance we're developing in order to really train our minds so that we can usher in that world unseen, unheard, yet surely there. And we can speak of it too, but only from experience will it be heard. So we need to practice for our own experience and for our own convincing and conviction in when we speak of a world unseen, unheard, and surely there. The Holy Spirit cannot ask more than you are willing to do. The strength to do comes from your undivided decision. The undivided decision, the same way Jesus speaks of it for himself. He said, the hardest thing that I learned to do was listen only to one voice. Listen to one voice only, meaning to listen to the Holy Spirit only, to train our minds that that's really what we want. Comes from your undivided decision. There is no strain in doing God's will as soon as you recognize that it is your own. So that strain is going out of things, isn't it? Because we realize, oh, this is really our will. This is where the joy is. This is where the peace is. This is where salvation is. It's in the mind. Salvation is for the mind. It's only in the mind. It isn't anywhere else. And so we're bringing, giving our mind a rest in a sense, and it's resting. It's now resting more and more in God. It's resting more and more in the Holy Spirit and with the true authority. And we're not so caught up in the dream, in the world, and in all the insanity that seems to go on. So it's not a strain to love our true identity. Where we thought it was going to require a lot of us, we're learning it requires very little of us. In fact, ultimately, nothing of us that we can't give right now in this moment. Right now in this moment, we can always give total attention to the Holy Spirit. And we're finding that we love that. So we're as Jesus tells us in, where was I? What chapter? What section? I think it's actually called the investment in reality. So we're actually starting to invest in reality instead of unreality. So when we focus on the world, we're actually focusing on unreality, and we're focusing on what cannot be seen, but we're seeing it because we value it. And we're turning toward the Holy Spirit and listening. Okay. Listening to his voice more and more consistently. And it's because it's our will to do so, because we love what we find there. We love our true identity. And we recently did a lesson, if you remember it, it's really stuck with me. It was lesson 352, and the lesson spoke about loving. Father, I would hear your voice. I would hear the voice of the Holy Spirit. I would hear your voice, and I would find your peace today. For I would love my own identity and find in it the memory of you. he's giving us in that lesson 352, he's giving us the experience of the third step of forgiveness, which is the acceptance of the atonement, which is our one responsibility of teachers of God. The one responsibility of the teacher of God is the acceptance of the atonement. And the acceptance of the atonement is nothing happened. I'm back home. I love my identity. I recognize it. I recognize that I'm under the authority of a true guide and teacher. So he's really giving us at the end of the text that experience. There is no strain in doing God's will as soon as you recognize it's your own. The lesson here is quite simple, but particularly apt to be overlooked. I will therefore repeat it, urging you to listen. Only your mind can produce fear. Only your mind can produce fear. Nothing else can produce fear. Nothing. Nothing else. It does so whenever it is conflicted in what it wants, producing inevitable strain because wanting and doing are discordant. What we truly want and what we're actually doing are mutually exclusive. So we're listening to two voices. We're still going back and forth, and we're in conflict when we choose any voice but the Holy Spirit. And that's our clue. Our clue is, when we're feeling fear, it's because we're conflicted between love and fear. We're conflicted between the two thought systems. This can be corrected only by accepting a unified goal. So, any thoughts? Up to now, we'll read on, but
what I really struck me is when you talked about us having the guilt that's produced by us being our own authority. I could see that it was like by me generating the world.
Yes,
it can't help but be produce guilt.
It's, when that really lands with us in a deep way, each individually, somehow, someday, if not already, I'm not saying it hasn't happened already for all of us, but that place where it really lands and you realize that's the whole problem, or one way of expressing the entire problem, but it is the entire problem. We're the authority, we're on our own, we will make our own decisions, thank you very much, and we'll have it our way, and so returning to the true authority and giving everything over to him is the way out of hell. That's a quote from Jesus. He said, this is your way out of hell, listening to and letting the Holy Spirit make the decisions.
I even think of the word authority. I think that the root of that is actually author, like who is the author here?
Yeah, the author. Who is the author? Is it you, or is it the Holy Spirit, the voice for God? So I'll read on. paragraph 7, the first corrective step in undoing the error is to know first that the conflict is an expression of fear. Say to yourself that you must somehow have chosen not to love. So the way we make fear real, or the way we make fear, is to choose not to love. That fear has no reality. So it's made, literally made out of love. Underneath it, as the Course teaches us, it's always made out of love. And so an attack is always a part of the cycle. So fear has no real substance, but so he says, say to yourself, sentence 2, that I must have chosen not to love, or this fear would not have risen. That's quite the switch, isn't it? If I'm fearful, to stop a minute and say, I must have chosen somehow not to love. Then the whole process of correction becomes nothing more than a series of pragmatic steps in the larger process of accepting the atonement as the remedy. I must have chosen not to love. It doesn't really acknowledge the fear, does it? It has you acknowledge love right away. Doesn't make an issue out of the fear. He says you can't, you can't overcome fear yourself. Anything I do against the fear is going to make the fear more real. So here are the pragmatic steps in the larger process of accepting the atonement. Nothing happened. These steps may be summarized in this way. Know first, this is fear. I'm feeling fear. Fear arises from a lack of love. I must have chosen not to love. The only remedy for lack of love is perfect love. Perfect love is the atonement. End of story. Perfect love is atonement.
Then what that suggests is that, we're never going to be satisfied with anything the world has to offer, even if we, have temporary, placations of what we think we want in the world. It never quite cuts it. And so that to me is actually a very hopeful thing. It means that inevitably everyone will choose against the insane belief in separation and want to go home. Yeah.
And we'll simply choose rightly. We'll simply, our willingness will have grown, deepened to the extent that we will accept this fully. because we are discovering, I mean, the first step here is to discover that we actually do like, in fact, love our true identity. That we actually begin to invest in reality and in time with the Holy Spirit. We actually stop talking about how afraid we are of it and how we don't want to do it. And because we're really learning that we do want it, that we do want this. It is our will. As he said, the part of the process is you have to realize that your will and God's will are the same will.
You know, it's kind of like it sort of like reminds me of a shortcut or a summary, a sort of a softer summary of the rules for decision. You know, but I'm in fear. Let's just be honest, right?
Absolutely.
And then you could accept perfect love instead. You do have a choice.
Yeah, and it can be that simple. Of course, it's usually not. We usually go through years and years of pretending we don't want to do this. So let's read on here. I have emphasized that the miracle or the expression of atonement is always a sign of respect from the worthy to the worthy.
Oh.
So he's going back to what he earlier taught us in chapter 1, which is the golden rule. And remember, he says, the golden rule is to look out from your holiness to the holiness of your brother, or look from the Holy Spirit to the Holy Spirit in him, in your brother. So his telling us we must have chosen not to love. And now he's going to tell us, how do we get back to love? We must have attacked. We must have judged our brother in some way. And that the sign of the atonement for us, our own healing of our mind, is to look out from my sinlessness to the sinlessness of my brother. From the worthy to the worthy, to correct that little mistake I made where I chose not to love. Or, you know, it could have been, and many times it is, I chose not to love my puppet, because for a moment I got all identified with the puppet and I forgot my identity, and I got all involved with the puppet and, you know, judged the puppet. But it's just no different than judging a brother. You know, it's more the silliness of how we separate. And once we do that, we can judge the heck out of ourselves too, our own puppet. So, you know, the worthiness of the usefulness of that puppet can be a good reminder that we can't get home without the puppet. For a little bit, we need some device to communicate with and through, and we may as well stop beating up on it and use it in the right way. And that's the golden rule. Very good. It is obvious, the recognition of this worth, brother to brother, holiness to holiness, is reestablished by the atonement, the correction, perfect love. Oh, perfect love. It is obvious then that when you are afraid, you have placed yourself in a position where you need atonement. You have done something loveless. Uh-oh, I did something loveless. I must have done something loveless because, you know, I stepped away. I'd feel conflict. I feel fear. I feel conflict. I feel fear. I must have done something loveless. Having chosen without love. This is precisely the situation for which the atonement was offered. The need for the remedy, the need immediately inspired its establishment. The need for the remedy established the remedy. Simultaneously, the atonement is the gift.
Then I just had a thought. It's interesting that the Holy Spirit has its immediate remedy, but the ego also has its immediate, fake remedy, which is basically, creating an imaginary problem, and then its imaginary solution is, all the things that it does to keep us mindless and keep really further anchor us in the guilt. And so, both are completely consistent. But,
Yes.
but again, as Ken points out, only one of them is completely sane.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And we're the chooser. We are the chooser.
I think we could use loveless, the word loveless as like a synonym for evil. It's a nice way to interpret.
Yes.
Just merely the lack of love, as we know.
Yes. Another simple little phrase that he introduced us to in chapter 1 again is how we must learn to think of ourselves is as loving and lovable.
Mm.
And then here he's giving these very, very specific directions that when we're fearful, it's because I have chosen not to love. That is the only way I can make fear. Fear isn't always lurking around. I literally make it by choosing not to love. Withholding love, I did that. Now I'm fearful and conflicted because I denied my identity. I denied my father. And now I think I'm on my own, and have to, I have to correct this. And I cannot correct this because I made the fear. So I believe in the fear. We believe in what we make. So there isn't any way that I can get out of that other than by the atonement. Perfect love. Perfect love is the atonement. I can't get out of it just a little bit and keep a little bit of the fear and, and work on that later. It's always going to be perfect love now is going to be the correction for my lovelessness, if you will, of my choice not to love. It's really surprisingly simple, isn't it? I mean, it really is. This is not a complicated course, but it's the seeing it for a moment, getting it for ourselves. Like what you shared, Jim, earlier, it's already gone from my mind. Do you remember what it was that you saw, Tim Tynan? You're muted, Jim.
It was about guilt and us associated, like whenever I think I have my way and I have to figure my way out, you can't help but induce guilt.
Yes. Yeah, that was it. That was it. I wish I could go right to it. Some places I can go right to, but some places I just can't. And it's a beautiful section where he talks about the Holy Spirit is your way out of hell. Literally, the Holy Spirit is your way out of hell. And guilt, because our guilt, again, is the idea that we're in charge here and we're doing this. All right, let's go back here. I know I'm flipping around a little bit. Let's go back to page 30, because there's more in this section that I wanted to cover.
Then before you go on, I was just going to respond to Jim's comment. As far as I have kind of this helpful association when I hear the word evil now, and this is as a result of an interview I heard years ago, but I kind of stuck with me. There was this Aramaic scholar named Neil Douglas Klotz, and he had this connection, basically explaining that in the original Aramaic, what the meaning of the word evil was that got put into our Bible, and therefore, mass consciousness through formal religion, was that the original meaning, translating of the word evil, was from the word unripe, which gives it a whole different meaning. Because you don't say, "Oh, I'm going to condemn that tree because it's March and all there are these little
Right.
things that aren't ready." And I was thinking, well, extrapolating that idea to what we believe we are as seemingly separate selves, we haven't expanded our identity to include everyone, and so that's a very unripe identity. And so the Holy Spirit basically is saying you need to just look at all the ways in which you separate yourself as things that are not mature, not ripe, and there's no judgment on that piece of fruit when it's not ready. It's just basically it hasn't grown to encompass the totality that it was meant to be. So I find that really helpful. So now it's kind of like a little mnemonic device that triggers that.
Yeah, thank you.
Rather than tying into the whole unconscious sin, guilt, fear paradigm of conventional religion, I think as the Course redefines so many religious words from the Bible, that one in particular is like, oh, now I've got a little mnemonic device to use. So.
Thank you, Bruce. I am going to use that because
good.
I think it's a great way to express not ready yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Just not ready yet.
It encompasses patience and tolerance and so many other things that the Course is reminding us, to not fight yourself and all that stuff.
Well, it's a good way to stay unripe oneself and wither on the vine, so to speak.
Right.
By being concerned about how somebody else isn't getting it or doing it or learning it, which is a hopeless preoccupation for anyone to indulge in is the errors of their brother, because it just takes us away from the subject at hand, which is always, where is my mind?
Bingo.
Where is my mind? Am I acting without love? Am I loveless? I must have attacked somebody. I must have pushed love away. I must have refused to be loving. So thank you for that. I'm sure everybody can use that one, ripe, unripe. Okay, I'm at the bottom of page 30. As long as you recognize only the need for the remedy. Now, this is very important, I think. I need atonement. I need the remedy because I acted without love. And I recognize that I have the need. But as long as you recognize only the need, you will remain fearful. However, as soon as you accept the remedy, the atonement, perfect love, as soon as you accept perfect love, you have abolished the fear. Obviously, from the little journey he just took us on, you can see how following those steps, if we accept, first of all, that the lack of love is a choice that we made not to love, and now we became fearful. So that's an essential part of this process, is we recognize the responsibility for that. And then it makes absolute total sense that the only answer here is perfect love.
That also fits nicely with the reveal, release, replace sequence of forgiveness, is that if we stay stuck on the reveal, and just only use ego's interpretation of things, which is basically all the alarm bells going off on our the dashboard of our mind, so to speak, or the console, and don't accept Holy Spirit's translation, then we're going to stay in fear, because we need to be able to release it in order to have it replaced. But the revelation without the other two steps, it just keeps us in fear, and then it just becomes a vicious circle that reinforces it rather than undoes it.
There is another place in here where he says, I turn to it. Forgiveness is an empty gesture unless it entails correction. Mm-hmm. Without this, it remains essentially judgmental rather than healing. I know I refused to love, but if I stop with that, if I don't go all the way through to the experience of perfect love here now, which is the acceptance of the atonement, I have not accepted the correction. And so the forgiveness still remains judgmental. Maybe it's judgment on myself now, but there's judgment in it. We've got to have the correction. Exactly.
I think in that the 3R mnemonic that I find helpful, to reveal, release, and replace, the reveal is recognizing that it's unconscious, the
Yes.
guilt. And then the second step of the release is allowing a Holy Spirit's assessment that it's unfounded. So if it's just unconscious guilt, then you're still stuck in that loop. But if it's unconscious and unfounded, and you allow the experience that that's unfounded and has no basis, and you get that, not just intellectually, but you really feel that, and then apply that to yourself and everyone you're around, then you're accepting the release that is offered.
Yeah. 3 steps of forgiveness. It's essential to go all the way. And if we don't, there's another place in the same chapter, not sure where it is, but where he says, all I would be saying is, if I don't accept the perfect love, all I'm saying is that I don't want to be healed. I don't want to be healed. Well, that's very helpful information. I mean, another point in this process here of coming to terms and being honest with ourselves. And, that if I don't want to be healed, then what is it that I want? And we can see the insanity of that. But without seeing the insanity of refusing to accept our own healing, which is always, again, it needs repeating over and over again. Healing can only occur in the mind. Healing does not occur anywhere else. So it's not going to be in behavior ever. It's always going to be in this point where I choose to accept atonement or not. I choose to accept the correction or not. So, very, very clear, all of this. Let me read on here. I somehow lost my place. What page was I on?
31.
31. All right, thank you. All right, here we go. Paragraph 9. Have we got a little time? Yeah, we do. Everyone experiences fear. Duh. You know, we're here. We have a body. We're just now sleepily waking up, you know, but snoozing a good part of the time, and that means fear. Yet it would take very little right thinking to realize why fear occurs. Here we go. Few appreciate the real power of the mind, and no one remains fully aware of it all of the time. However, if you hope to spare yourself from fear, there are some things you must realize, and realize fully. The mind is very powerful. The mind is very powerful. And it never loses its creative force. It never sleeps. Every instant it is creating. It is hard to recognize that thought and belief combine into a power surge that can literally move mountains. He's referring to stories in the Bible and that often get spoken of in terms of the power of our minds. It appears at first glance that to believe such power about yourself is arrogant. But that is not the real reason you do not believe in the power of your mind. You prefer to believe that your thoughts cannot exert real influence because you are actually afraid of them. We're literally afraid of the power of thought. And guess why?
We'll choose wrongly.
We told ourselves a lot of lies.
Guess which cockroach thought system is suddenly exposed to the light?
Exactly. So you prefer to believe that your thoughts cannot exert real influence because you are actually afraid of them. So let that sink in for a moment. And does anybody have any thoughts about that? I mean, I'm sure if we really began to look at this, we'd find that we have little habits of mind that actually indicate we are afraid of the power of our mind.
Bob Rosenthal, who's one of the co-presidents of Foundation for Inner Peace, has written a second book, which is wonderful. It's called From Nevermind to Evermind. And in it, he talks about, it doesn't go into great detail, but the concept really struck me as really interesting, because it's like our ego mind, in order to avoid notice and to evade observation, makes these macros, kind of like computer macros, that things that trigger certain ways of thinking about things that happen so quickly that we don't even recognize that we've, as the Course says, picked up the sword, Mm-hmm. And I thought, wow, that I think is a great way to observe when you're not at peace, to say, oh, I've picked up the sword. I've executed this automatic response that may be, the accumulation of lifetimes of self-demeaning, self-deprecating identity that's of separation. But we have our own little unique patterns that appear to be very specialized, So if we can just kind of wash the mind with Holy Spirit helping us and say, okay, I'm going to look at this pattern and see whenever I, suddenly go into fear, what's the real reason for that? And it kind of undoes that macro by kind of looking at all the steps and say, oh, well, this is where I jumped to this conclusion, and this is where I made this false assumption. This is where, I tried to validate this incorrect premise, and then it kind of dissects and deconstructs those macros in the mind, and it's sort of like watching it in slow motion. Say, oh, that's where the ego snuck in.
Mhm. Mhm.
Anyway,
I find in those explorations, when there's fear, when there's tension, when I've acted lovelessly, there is if I start investigating, I always find a loveless idea, something, but it's, we really live in the world of ideas, and there's an idea that I am perpetuating. And then, of course, there are thoughts behind that idea, but to see it and see how repetitive some of those ideas are, and they're going to be repetitive until the cycle is broken.
And we repeat a different pattern.
Yeah.
And I think that's what the brilliance of those early workbook lessons, which gradually, transition to from a few times a day to a few times a second, ultimately. But that's not said directly, but it's implied, is that we're gradually, on this trajectory between the ego's going, the identity is going like this, and the Holy Spirit's identity is on this, kind of this crossover, and when that never, kind of in between land, it seems confusing, and he mentions that, but we just kind of have to hang in there and keep practicing the forgiveness, and letting everybody off the hook whenever we are tempted to condemn, and just say, okay, there I go again. I must have been afraid of that peace and that love, and now I can
it's
deal with it more quickly. Yeah.
It's always surprising when we start a new immersion and we start the lessons again, how much comes up doing those first lessons.
Yeah.
It's it's amazing. There's always more.
Well, Ken even says that just like the analogy, the first couple of chapters, the first 10 or however many lessons is all about showing it's giving you the whole metaphysics of the course in a very short time.
Yes.
Now, whether you can accept that or not is entirely up to you, but
yes, and I'm thinking as we go along, this, as I mentioned earlier, is the 6th immersion one we've done. And I can see how going through the course over and over again with the lessons and teaching the lessons, how valuable it has been in being able to also speak as we're speaking today. We can speak like this as we're speaking today to a class of relatively new to the course students, and they can get it. They get it because, I'm not saying everybody has to or does, but because our conviction has deepened so much that we can speak with conviction, and that's really conveyed. It's contagious in a sense. The work is slow, but it's paying off for ourselves in doing this. So let's see here. I don't want to run I know I'm probably running in over. I am, and I do want to complete this section. So here we are back at paragraph 9 on page 31. And he just told us we can spare ourselves from fear But there are some things we have to realize, and we have to realize it fully, that the mind is powerful. It never sleeps. It can move mountains. And that the reason we don't use that power is because we're afraid of our thoughts. We don't want to go back to our mind. We don't want to be the chooser of our thoughts and choose them with the help of the Holy Spirit. Let the Holy Spirit teach us the thoughts that are valuable and the ones we really truly want to let go of. So the idea that we're afraid of our thoughts and we don't have to look at them and deal with them, he says this may allay the awareness of the guilt of how you've misused your mind, but at the cost of perceiving the mind as impotent. So that's where we find ourselves. We've misused our thoughts. We've misused the mind, and it is now impotent, seen as impotent. If you believe that what you think is ineffectual, you may cease to be afraid of it, but you will hardly respect it. We will hardly respect who we are, the Holy Spirit, in learning that we can love that we want to be that we enjoy our true identity. We are not likely to respect it until we start to actually use it for a right use. And then the closing, there are no idle thoughts. All thinking produces form at some level. All thinking produces thought and form at some level. There are no idle thoughts. So when we're running on idle and the thoughts are just, just moving on.
It's still harnessing the huge manufacturing process, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm reminded of a line from Richard Bach's book, wonderful little book, Illusions, if anybody remembers that one, Adventures of a Reluctant Messiah. There's one place where Richard and Don Shimoda are having this conversation, and Richard says, well, it's just my imagination, he says. And Don Shimoda says, just your imagination? This world is your imagination. These are MGM Worlds and Warner Brothers lifetimes. I remember that quote for some reason. It just stuck with me. It's like, I just thought, wow. And then he goes on in the next paragraph about cause and effect. It's hardly help you if I deprecated the power of your own thinking. Anyway, it's kind of like the prime directive, if you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we can up the ante in a sense, and start paying attention to our thoughts and looking at them and changing our minds about our thoughts.
If we're making up a whole universe, just think what we can do if we get out of the dysfunctional thought system and allow our mind to resonate with the created universe where we really are.
With the thoughts that, the thoughts of God. I wanted to close with just a little bit from chapter 30, page 632, the thought God holds of you. 632. So the thought of God obviously is the only thought. There is only one thought, and that thought is a never-ending thought that had no beginning and has no end. I will read here. Your will is granted, not in any form that would content you not, but in the whole completely lovely thought God holds of you. Nothing that God knows not exists. Nothing that God knows not exists. And what he knows exists forever, changelessly. For thoughts endure as long as does the mind that thought of them. And in the mind of God, there is no ending, nor a time in which his thoughts were absent or could suffer change. Thoughts are not born and cannot die. They share the attributes of their creator, nor have they a separate life apart from his. The thoughts you think are in your mind as you are in the mind which thought of you. And so there are no separate parts in what exists within God's mind. It is forever one, eternally united, and at peace. The thought God holds of you is perfectly unchanged by your forgetting. It will always be exactly as it was before the time when you forgot, and will be just the same when you remember. And it is the same within the interval when you forgot. The thoughts of God are far beyond all change and shine forever. They await not birth. They wait for welcome and remembering. The thought God holds of you is like a star, unchangeable in an eternal sky. So high in heaven is it set that those outside of heaven know not it is there. Yet still and white and lovely will it shine through all eternity. There was no time it was not there, no instant when its light grew dimmer or less perfect ever was. Who knows the Father knows this light, for he is the eternal sky that holds it safe, forever lifted up and anchored sure. Its perfect purity does not depend on whether it is seen on earth or not. The sky embraces it and softly holds it in its perfect place, which is as far from earth as earth from heaven. It is not the distance nor the time that keeps this star invisible to earth. Beyond all idols is the thought God holds of you, completely unaffected by the turmoil and the terror of the world, the dreams of birth and death that are here dreamed of, the myriad of forms that fear can take. Quite undisturbed, the thought God holds of you remains exactly as it always was, surrounded by a stillness so complete, no sound of battle comes remotely near. It rests in certainty and perfect peace. Here is your one reality, kept safe, completely unaware of all the world that worships idols and that knows not God, in perfect sureness of its changelessness and of its rest in its eternal home. The thought God holds of you has never left the mind of its creator, whom it knows as its creator knows that it is there. The thought God holds of you is your reality. Forget not then that idols must keep hidden what you are, not from the mind of God, but from your own. The star shines still. The day has never changed. But you, the Holy Son of God himself, are unaware of your reality. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for sharing this lesson today.
Thanks.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Lynn.
A good week.